Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome to The World Over Live. As you can see, we are not in our studios tonight. That's coming in 2 weeks. I know a number of you have been calling and writing and emailing. We are setting up a new studio right on Capitol Hill, and I'm not going to say anything else about it. Just stay tuned. It's good looking. Coming up, we've got a great show for you. As you know, those of you in the United States anyway, the GOP primaries are underway as various candidates vie for who will have their nomination for the presidency. Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum, Ron Paul, Mitt Romney has won a number of these contests, and now they're fighting in South Carolina. Coming up, Pat Buchanan will be commenting on all of that, the syndicated columnist and author of so many books. And a little later, we'll talk about the terrible situation in China, the human rights violation, the military buildup, and much more with Stephen Mosher at the Population Research Institute. But first, let's get to politics and the Catholic vote. Where will it go this year? I sat down in an exclusive interview with Patrick Buchanan, author of Suicide of a Superpower, his latest book. He's also an MSNBC contributor and a contributor to the McLaughlin Group. He also, incidentally, ran for president a number of times, winning the New Hampshire primary. Here's Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan, first of all, thanks for allowing us into your home.
Delighted.
I want to start with this Romney series of victories. First Iowa, now New Hampshire. Now this fight goes to the South, South Carolina next week, and then on to Florida and the Deep South. What happens to Romney there?
I think if Romney can win South Carolina, it's all over. I think it's pretty much all over right now because I don't see anybody who can beat him. But in South Carolina, I think Newt is well motivated, clearly.
To put it lightly.
And I think he's going to go after him with everything. But the Republican establishment will try to get Newt to back off these attacks on Bain Capital because they see that as an attack on Republican philosophy and ideology. And they see it as giving ammunition to Barack Obama in the fall, and that's correct.
Now, when Pat Buchanan was a presidential candidate...
The Pitchfork Brigades.
The Pitchfork Pat. I remember those days, the Buchanan Brigades. You waved an economic plan and a vision that was considered at the time unorthodox. They were trying to say you're out of step with the Republican Party. And I made the argument, looking at the plan and what you were saying, that Pat Buchanan is showing a concern for the human effects of these economic choices. And to my mind, it seemed like a Catholic approach to the economy. Is that what you see coming from Newt Gingrich and the ideas that he's trying to communicate here?
Well, they're communicating sentiments, but the problem is they are very libertarian in their ideas. They do believe in the global economy. They did pass NAFTA and GATT and the World Trade Organization, most favored nation treatment for China, bringing China into the WTO. These were the decisions that deindustrialized America and took our manufacturing and shipped it over to Asia and China. In the first decade of the 20th century, we lost 5 to 6 million manufacturing jobs and 50,000 factories. Now, I said this would happen in 1990, and they all went for it. And now what they are doing, the Republicans, excuse me, but they are up there deploring the consequences of what they themselves did. And they're trying to say we're going to bring manufacturing back. But they don't address the question of why we lost it. And I think the Republican Party was in large part responsible for that, as well as Bill Clinton and the Bushes. But I think they see the consequences of that. They see it cost us the Reagan Democrats, and they're trying to bring them home by saying we're going to bring the jobs home. And so I understand what they're doing, but it is very late in the afternoon.
Gingrich said he was going to run a positive campaign, and then he went into the buzzsaw of Mitt Romney in Iowa, and now I think the term they're using is we're contrasting ourselves with the other candidates. Used to be called negative ads, but...
When I saw Newt's concession speech in Iowa, I haven't seen revenge like that on display since I read The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe when I was in high school. Remember it? When he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge.
Yeah, that was it.
But really, But I can understand Newt's motivation. Imagine yourself, Raymond, you're leading in Iowa, you're leading in South Carolina, you're leading in Florida, you're leading nationally, you're opening up a huge lead over Mitt Romney, you're closing in New Hampshire, and all of a sudden for 3 weeks you are savaged as basically a Beltway bandit who enriched himself by betraying his principles, and you see it all gone in 3 weeks. You are well motivated after something like that.
Yeah, I'll bet. But was Bain, is attacking Bain Capital and Mitt Romney, characterizing Mitt Romney as a looter, as a capitalist opportunist, if you will, is that the right tact? And will that play in South Carolina and on into Florida?
Yes, it would. Let me say this. It would also play in killing Newt Gingrich forever in the Republican Party. But to portray him as a predator capitalist, a vulture capitalist in the happy phrase of the governor of Texas, with the vulture sitting on the limb, looking for sick companies and coming down to loot them and getting rid of the workers and picking the carcass and leaving the bones. I mean, this type of attack, frankly, is what could separate, if well done, as Obama's people would do it, could separate the Reagan Democrats and the conservative Democrats who are disillusioned with Obama. They could separate them from the Republicans and Mitt Romney. And that's why you saw the real reaction on the Republican establishment. I mean, this could bleed the Republican candidate. There's no question about it. And it really goes to some of the issues that we made in 1992 and 1996, Raymond, which were basically, look, this is a capitalist free enterprise system, but there are some ways of making money in a capitalist system which are really commendable. And there are some businessmen, like my old friend Roger Milliken, who rebuilt this big carpet plant right after it burned down in the same town. And he spent all this money there. He didn't go to Mexico. And he saved his workers. And there are other people like George Soros, for example, who make all their money, by shorting the British pound. So when you take a look at that billionaires list, there are probably a lot of people that created a lot of jobs and did a lot of wonderful things, and there are others who just who made their money in the giant casino. And morally speaking, I think there is a differentiation between those kinds of businessmen and those kinds of capitalists.
Now, Gingrich has also opened up another line of critique on Mitt Romney going into South Carolina. He opened with an abortion ad, making all sorts of claims that Romney appointed a pro-abortion judge. He put Planned Parenthood on a state medical board and refused to allow pro-lifers there. They go down the line. How does that play among the evangelicals and serious Catholics there in South Carolina?
That will be somewhat damaging to Mitt in South Carolina, because it's very direct, and the social conservatives and folks who believe in life, right to life, is very strong there. And so that would obviously hurt him with it. You're going directly at it. But if Mitt did those things, then you have to answer for him. But one thing about Mitt is that you have to realize is, we all realize, look, he's up there in the People's Republic of Massachusetts. If you're going to pick 10 judges, you're probably hard to find, and you got a Democratic legislature of 85%. And so what you got to do is you got to go and say, look, give me this judge and I'll give you that one. And that's the way you have to deal with it. And I think Romney can somewhat defend himself that, I was not living in South Carolina. Massachusetts is another country.
And no doubt that's going to be
I think he ought to use that. But
Yeah.
I do think it looks to me like it's hard for me to see at this point how they stop Mitt, and frankly, who stops him. And if someone does stop him, can that individual beat Barack Obama?
Let's talk about Mitt Romney for a moment, and then I want to talk about these other insurgent candidates. 5 former Vatican ambassadors, U.S. ambassadors to the Vatican, have endorsed Romney. What role do you think that kind of endorsement plays, or does it have any impact at all among Catholic voters?
I think it would have. I think there's a lot of folks that listen to Raymond Arroyo, and a lot of those folks probably skeptical of Mitt Romney. They've looked at his record, and I think it's helpful. I do think it's helpful. I don't know that it is as helpful. That the Catholic community has the kind of moral clout that we had in the 1950s.
All right, but it's still the swing vote. It's still a deciding swing vote.
It is the swing vote, and it moves back and forth between the parties, and there's still a lot of traditionalist Catholics. I think it is very helpful in this sense that it seems somewhat unexpected that Mitt, with all the statements about his role in the 1990s, would have five. I mean, Marianne Glendon was on there.
Marianne Glendon and Tom Malady and
these are all real,
Ambassador Nicholson.
Yeah,
Jim
there's
Nicholson.
some real heroes of the right to life movement in there. And so what they're saying is that, you know, Mitt's good on this issue, and he was in a rough situation up there in Massachusetts. And I think that's a credible argument.
I want to look at these numbers. Both the Tea Party movement as well as the Catholic vote in Iowa went for him. Same thing happened in New Hampshire. Look at these numbers. 30% of evangelicals in New Hampshire broke for Mitt Romney. 45% of Catholics. You contrast that with Gingrich, who had 13% of the evangelicals, and Rick Santorum, who only got 23%. What does that tell you? Is there an alternative, a conservative, a faith candidate to rival Romney?
I don't think there is. I mean, the only one I think that would do it would be Santorum. But you mean, he's a Catholic. With due respect, Catholics have a tough time in the South with the evangelicals. They may not have as tough a time as the Mormon folks down there. But I think Mitt did passably well. If he got 30% in New Hampshire when he was getting 40%, he's not doing quite as well with those folks. But I do think once you get south, and there are some folks down there that are really very, very hostile to Mormonism. There's no doubt about it. I think his worst performing states in 2008 were the southern states. But I think again, I believe he's probably going to be the nominee, and these folks are going to have to reconcile themselves and ask themselves a question in November, if Mitt's the nominee, that let's say Ruth Bader Ginsburg stands down from the Supreme Court, and we've got 4 solid conservative traditionalist justices. Who do you want picking the next justice of the United States who can decide Roe v. Wade? Barack Obama, who's already picked 2, or do you want Mitt Romney picking the justice? And it seems to me that's an open and shut case. If Mitt's the nominee, for evangelical Christians and traditionalist Catholics to say, we may have doubts about Mitt Romney, but far better that he be in there than Barack Obama.
Now, you said that the only guy you see who could do this, who could mount a credible insurgency against Mitt Romney, would be Rick Santorum. Look at his performance in New Hampshire, where you broke through. You won New Hampshire when you ran. What was that? 92?
There was 96.
90,
we won it.
That's right. You won in 96, and that was then you had 98,000 blue-collar workers. Now you're down to 66,000. Is that why he lost?
Well, I think that's one reason he lost, and the second reason is, to be candid, I don't know that Rick Santorum has thought through the reasons why the manufacturing departed from this country. Where was he in the 1990s? We knew what was going to happen if you took the highest wage country in the world and dropped it into a global economy where the average wage is $2 or $3, an hour. That the wages were going to go down and the manufacturing was going to go to the low-wage countries. And I think that, I don't know that they've thought this all through, or that they present it in as great a depth as it needs to be. And I think that Santorum, it really was, I was astonished when you come out of Iowa with a tremendous campaign he ran out there. You run dead even with the front runner, and then you get a bounce from 4 or 5 to 9.
Where does he go from here, Pat? In the South? Because
the reason I say he has a possibility is, I think Newt is, Newt is a suicide bomber on his way to the Romney headquarters. And everybody knows it. And you can't vote for him. And I think the best he can do down there is blow up Romney to a degree. I don't know how effective he can be, but that's what he's about. Whereas Santorum, you notice, did not go to the Bain capital, vulture capitalism issue. He stayed away from that. And of course, Ron Paul stayed away because that's just fine with him.
Yeah, that's right. It's just fine with him.
Yeah.
Now, where does Santorum go from here, though? In the South, how do you think he plays in the South? Rick Santorum's a guy of the North from Pennsylvania.
Western Pennsylvania. I think he has a very tough time in South Carolina, and Florida's a different state. Florida's a nation state, a variety of places. But I think, he's very Catholic, and he's very deeply on social conservative issues, contraception as well as right to life. And he talks about these constantly. I think if he could get in a one-on-one with Mitt Romney in South Carolina, I think he would have a fighting chance. But look who he's got in there. Got Ron Paul taking off 15-20% of the vote. He's going to have Newt was running way ahead, who's going to get a pretty good vote down there. And you got Rick Perry, the governor, and he's strongly evangelical Christian. And now you got Huntsman down there. So it's hard for me to see how this crowd moves along and goes after Mitt. The great success of the Romney campaign, frankly, replicates the success of the Dole campaign, which is the conservatives in that race, and I was certainly one of them. We could not get a clean one-on-one shot against the front runner. I mean, and even when you're in Iowa, for example, you know, I came 3 points behind Bob Dole, and Alan Keyes got 8 points on a 100% right to life issue, and I was all 100% right to life myself. If he'd have been out of there, and I had beaten Dole, and I could have beaten him, I think if I'd knocked him down twice, I think he would not have gotten up.
But Pat, when you look at the breakdown of these numbers, even in New Hampshire, those who are most concerned about abortion, they voted for Romney. And even when you add up the numbers of Catholics, let's isolate Catholics, 10% of Catholics went for Newt Gingrich, 8% went for Rick Santorum. That's only 19%. You can't match that up against the 45% of Catholics that went for Romney.
I think that what the Catholics are saying is, first, that Mitt Romney comes from Massachusetts. We know him. He now says he is strongly pro-life. We tend to believe him. Maybe we're skeptical. But this guy can beat Barack Obama. And if we can beat Barack Obama, we get the Supreme Court justices. And these other fellows can't beat Barack Obama. So I think they put it all together and they say, for November, that Mitt Romney's the best bet we got.
Because the conservatives have never been able to carve out the one guy who they would support. So you've scattered the vote.
It's just like 2008. They couldn't get together, and so John McCain
parachuted
waltzed right into the nomination.
Let's talk about Ron Paul for a moment. Now everybody's kind of poo-pooing Ron Paul, but the fact is he came in number 3 in Iowa with a big chunk of the vote. He came in number 2 in New Hampshire, 24% of the vote. Clearly something, I mean, I went to some of the caucuses in Iowa and watched the excitement around this guy. There clearly are people, some new to the political scene, who are energized, not by this man. I mean, the fact is, the man, rhetorically and visibly, he's not exactly the most edifying. I mean, this isn't, Churchill walking on the scene. They're reacting to the message, what he's saying. What is the message here for the Republican Party and for this slate of candidates? What should they take from this Ron Paul insurgency?
Well, what Ron Paul does have is authenticity. He is real. I mean, when he talks about big government conservatism, he was the only guy opposing Bush on No Child Left Behind and on Medicare prescription drugs, the unfunded entitlement. His whole career, he's been talking about
and all these adventures into the Middle East and all of that.
Exactly, but on those issues, I think that's really where he makes his mark. 2/3 of the American people now think Iraq was a mistake. Who voted against Iraq of all those Republican candidates? So when he speaks from experience, says, I voted this way. And secondly, I do think people believe that we've had too many wars and the empire's got to be downsized. It has tremendous appeal to young people. And I know he's 76-year-old and I'm nipping at his heels, and it's very funny in a way, but it's also real. This is a very real, I went down and I campaigned for him, and I think it was 1994 when he was coming back running for the House. And I went to the Houston airport, as I recall, and we drove 3 hours into this place. And they had German clog dancers, some little German community that had come over the 19th century. And I got up and spoke, and we headed 3 hours back to the airport. But it was a wonderful, real middle America event. And, I've always liked him. I've always liked the guy because I think he's just genuine. I think he's real. I think he's honest. He has his convictions. I don't agree with him. I'm not a libertarian on trade or on the cultural, on the social issues. I do think a community's got a right to establish what it believes to be true and have its faith represented in its schools and things like that. And I think he's much more libertarian on that than I am. But he is a very likable fellow, and I think the foreign policy, the fact that get out of these wars, Bring the boys home, downsize
And the
the
debt,
empire.
and his concern about the debt and the out of
Well,
control
the debt,
spending.
and he's who put the Federal Reserve on the national agenda. The reason we know the Fed has given money to everybody in the world is because he said we want all that stuff out on the table. And so he had the courage of his convictions back there, and a lot of things he's done well. I mean, I think Ben Bernanke is someone who knows who Ron Paul is.
Oh, I'll bet.
I mean, and who else did it? Nobody.
Step back for a moment. I want you to quickly talk about Rick Perry. Rick Perry was seen as the golden boy
Right.
when he emerged, and then he had his oops moment in that debate, and he's rhetorically challenged, it seems.
Well, I must say, when he first showed up, I really liked him. You know, he said, Ben Bernanke comes down to Texas, things are going to get real ugly.
No, he's a tough guy.
It's that, I love that Texas bravado and that. I mean, it's all, he's kidding.
And he's pro-life. He's a great governor down there.
He's a good governor. He's got a very attractive personality. He looks like a terrific fellow, quite frankly, of all the guys up there. But there's no doubt he's not prepared for, he wasn't prepared for a presidential contest. And he wasn't schooled deeply in national issues and international issues at all. Understandably, he's down there in Texas. You got a nation-sized state. You got a border problem there, and I think he was not aware. And you have to be sort of aware. I mean, like most of the folks inside the Beltway, you know, we know all these issues. We know you can't step here. You have to, you know, and
pivot there, shade that.
And
don't say that.
he steps in every cow pie in the pasture, you know, because he hadn't been through it before. So,
well, the other thing here,
but he is. I will say this: of all, I mean, he's about the most likable guy out there, I think. In terms of just being sort of, you know, if you were sitting down having a beer and he walked into the bar, you could see a big grin. He'd come over and sit beside you, you know, and.
Well, he's a guy also, when you look at all of these candidates and you lay out their plans, everybody says they're worried about the economy, they're worried about jobs. When you start laying these plans out and comparing them, I've had economists tell me, Rick Perry's got a pretty good, clear, flat tax plan. Newt Gingrich has got an interesting plan. When you get to some of the top tier candidates, they have, these are very kind of murky plans that resemble the guy they're going to be running against in November.
And the murkiest is the highest, right?
Yeah, I mean, Mitt Romney's plan is, the Wall Street Journal said, it's kind of tepid. It doesn't do much.
I'll tell you who's got a good plan, and it was very interesting, is Huntsman. It was excellent. You take a look at his foreign policy and what he said he wanted to do. Last night, right after the New Hampshire thing, he said he wanted to get out of Afghanistan now. But his tax plan and his foreign policy and other issues, he's fine. I just, for the life of me, don't know why he decided to run as a Darwinist.
Yeah, exactly, on the way in.
Why do you come in and say, you know, I believe in Darwin? You know what the thing, he started his campaign at a cocktail party in New York, you know. You win, you know, when you win the Manhattan primary, you're not going to win any others.
But the problem is, you and I may be the only people reading these plans. Most Americans, they're getting all of their information from quick sound bites and their visual impression of these candidates. Is that a disservice to this republic, to say nothing of the presidency and the rest of it?
Well, I don't know how you get around it. I mean, Herman Cain had the right idea, 999.
Yeah, brand,
until people
brand.
started looking at it, and they value-added taxes and sales taxes, you know. But, you know, I mean, this is one of the imperatives, and, you know, maybe it's not a good thing, but the American people, they do watch those debates, and that's the only chance, other than Iowa and New Hampshire, they get to see these folks, and so you've got to be able to get your plan down into a soundbite. I mean, in truth, I think Eisenhower may not have been able to do that, and I think he was a fine president. But that's what you have to know in this day and age. You got to be able to use that. Jack Kennedy and the television age changed things. You got to have some charisma and an ability to communicate. And if you don't, if you're one of these, but I don't want to mention the candidates. We were running in '96, and this guy got up and he was talking this long, windy speech in Manchester, New Hampshire, you know. And these guys are out there, they're all interested in guns and things like that. And he's meandering on about the world, and you just said goodbye.
So long.
He's a famous person, you know. And you say, that's no problem.
Where do you think the Catholic vote's going to go this time?
I think it's going to be split, and I think it's going to go probably 55-45 Republican this time. It's hard for me to believe, though, mean, what kind of the Catholic community would vote for someone who beat Hillary Rodham Clinton out for the endorsement of the feminist pro-abortion group? Yeah. Amazing. I mean, that fella, there's not a single pro-abortion bill he wasn't all for. And he wins that endorsement?
But again, doesn't that tell us something about what we just talked about? The image, how that image trumps position, life, all of these issues, because people get wrapped up in that image of the person, and their takeaway is just that. Wow, he looks so inspirational. Wow, he looks like a president. Well, that's no qualification.
Exactly.
Well, a lot of these people didn't look like presidents.
Yeah, if we get caught up in the movie, and he's the hero. Right. Hero of the movie, and isn't this marvelous? We got a young, attractive, articulate African-American here who a friendly fella, got a nice family and all. And wouldn't it be wonderful if he were up there, you know? And I think and there's an awful lot of that, and I think that was probably decisive in both the primary and the general election,
We've been hearing reports you're off of MSNBC, they're not sure about it. The president over there has said, well, he's on an extended leave. What's going on now?
It's unresolved, Raymond.
Unresolved at the moment.
At the moment.
Okay. Well, I know you had a little health. Well, we had some health woes for a little bit, but I'm glad to see Pitchfork Pat back and fighting for.
Well, we're back, and we had a little some problems back in November and December, and it took me off the trail when I was promoting Suicide of a Superpower, which I regret. I really wanted to get out there and sell that book and its ideas. Maybe we can do it with the paperback.
Yeah, well, those ideas are coming to pass, whether you were out selling them then or not. We see you look at some of these polls.
They've gotten some attention, that's true.
The drop-off of faith, which you talk about in the book at length, people who now, there was a new USA Today piece I just saw, 46% of people say they never wonder whether they'll go to heaven or not. This will no doubt have some impact on the political situation, to say nothing of the much more important cultural outcome here.
I mean, Christianity, Protestant Christianity, Catholicism, what was it? It was about 95% of the country, almost as late as 1960, and then it went down to 85% in 1990. It's now 75%, and I think down to 70% among younger people. And the faith and the moral consensus and the moral code and the ethical code it produces and the culture it produces, these are the things that make us Americans. These are the things we had in common. And if all that goes out, one of the questions in the book, what holds us together? And you talk to me and you go through there, the poets, it seems to me, Yeats and some of the others, and Solzhenitsyn, Matthew Arnold and the others, they got it right. You know, the light is going out. And it'll, on the gleam from the French shore is going out. And this is, a century and a half ago. If that goes, I mean, what holds us together? There's even a good quote in there by Fukuyama in a review he wrote of a book on Nietzsche. And he said, you can throw out, Christianity and all the rest of it, as Nietzsche does, but when you do, what happens to the compassion it produced? What happened to the wonderful things it produces? Does all that go out with them? And what kind of country and society do we become? It was a very good question he asked, and that's what I wonder. And I'm and I am, as someone said, this is not an optimistic book, Pat.
Well, it's not an optimistic time, though, Pat. I mean, they're dark.
It is not.
There's always hope. There's always possibility of things turning around. But you also have to properly and clearly look at where you are now.
This is the last of those books I'm going to write. But it's really your last statement on these issues that some people say that, we're really headed down for this brave new world and the rest of it. I don't think so. I think there are things wrong about America, the America I was growing up in, but you take a look at where we're headed and you take a look at what's happening in Europe, to the society there in London last summer, and you say, where are we going? And there's a lot more people than Pat Buchanan who are writing about this. And frankly, you get Belloc and some of these other writers, Solzhenitsyn back there and the others, and they're all saying, this is what's going to happen. T.S. Eliot,
Always, you see far down the road, and let us sound the alarm. So thank you for that, and thank you for the interview.
Well, thank you for coming over to the house again.
Suicide of a Superpower, Pat Buchanan's latest book, is available at bookstores everywhere and at the usual outlets. And you can always read his columns at humanevents.com. Up next, we'll look at the troubling trend in China, the one-child policy, what it's wrought, the military buildup, and much more. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to the World Over Live. I'm Raymond Arroyo. In recent weeks, I've been reading coverage of China and talking to some experts here in Washington. The religious and human rights situation there is dire. I decided to sit down with Stephen Mosher. He's president of the Population Research Institute. Now, Mr. Mosher was one of the first social scientists who went into mainland China and chronicled the effects of the one-child policy, and he's been doing so ever since. We thought on this 30th anniversary of that policy, and as headlines continue to mount up, he could give us some clarity on the situation. Here's Stephen Mosher. Steve, we recently passed the grisly anniversary of the Chinese one-child policy. Now, you've been covering this for a good number of years. Tell me, 30 years ago, how you first became acquainted with this barbaric practice.
Well, 30 years ago, I was living in a Chinese village. Actually, now it's more than 30 years ago. It's about 33 years ago. I was the first American social scientist allowed to do research in the People's Republic of China. I was living in a large community in South China, about 5,000 people, when the one-child policy came into being. And local party officials were told that they could not allow women illegally pregnant with second and third and fourth children to give birth. And what they did in that circumstance horrified me, and I think horrified the villagers of the place where I was living, because they went door to door. They identified the women who were pregnant illegally, and then they told them that they had no choice but to terminate their pregnancies. Some of these women were actually arrested for the crime of being pregnant and taken from their homes and families to a government lockup some miles distant. I went with them, and there I saw them told from morning to night by senior Communist Party officials, invariably male, that they would have to go in for their abortions, and sadly, all of them did, one after the other. Many under escort because the officials were afraid they would flee. They were brought into the local abortion clinic. They were given poison shots into the womb to kill their unborn children. And if they didn't deliver the baby within the next 48 hours, the doctors would then go in and do cesarean section abortions, opening up the women with a cesarean section and then removing the now dead or dying babies. I was present for those atrocities. I took pictures of those atrocities. And I thought probably, Raymond, 33 years ago, I thought, okay, this is an isolated instance. This is going to carry on for a few months or maybe a year or two at most. But it wasn't isolated. This has been national policy for over 3 decades, and it continues today. We continue to get stories out of China of the same thing happening.
How did you first become aware of this? There was a story of you were eating at a restaurant or something in a village?
Well, I became aware of it because I was good friends with the local Communist Party secretary who was in charge of the village. Because the Communist Party, 80 million strong, run China. Let there be no mistake about that. It's a one-party dictatorship. And he and I had a fairly good relationship. So when he received this directive from the central government saying, you must abort women illegally pregnant, he brought it over to my house and he showed it to me. He said, Steve, I thought you'd like to see this. And of course, I was interested in seeing all the government documents I could. And I read it, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I said, how are you going to enforce this? He said, it's very simple. We'll just do a house-to-house survey. We'll identify the women who need remedial measures. That's what they called it. They didn't call it an abortion. They called it remedial measures. And then we will make sure they get abortion so that we stay within our quota, so that we don't allow any illegal children to be born.
Now, the toll has now reached 450 million people who've been exterminated in this fashion. Why don't we hear more about this?
Well, the Chinese government has made no bones about the fact that they have eliminated over 400 million people. In fact, a friend of mine, Congressman Tim Holzkamp from Kansas, was talking to a senior official from the Ministry of Health just a couple of months ago. and asked how many people had been eliminated because of the one-child policy, and this official said, 400 million people. And the official then proudly went on to say, this is more than the population of your United States. And we have contributed to an end of China's environmental problems, and we have contributed to solving the problem of global warming by eliminating all these people. He was proud of the fact that they had carried out a butchery on a scale unknown in human history.
Wow. Now there are effects being felt within China now. They are having some labor difficulties.
Absolutely.
The ratio, male-female
Absolutely.
ratio is skewed. Tell us about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the labor difficulties. There have been labor shortages in China's coastal provinces, places like Tianjin and Shanghai and Fujian province and Guangdong province in the south now, for 15 or 20 years. And they've solved those labor shortages by bringing in workers from the hinterland, from the interior provinces like Sichuan and Gansu. Well, now they've run out of people. If you travel in the interior of China, as I have, you go to villages and what you find are elderly men and women and their grandchildren from 1 to about 15 years of age. But you don't find any youth, you don't find any people in the Middle Ages, because they've all moved to the cities and they're all working in the factories. China, amazingly enough, despite its huge population, has run out of workers, and there will be next year a nationwide labor shortage in China because they've eliminated 400 million of the most productive, enterprising people on the face of the planet.
Wow. Tell us about the male-female ratio. 160 million girls killed under this policy. Why are girls targeted, and are they targeted at a higher rate than men?
Oh, absolutely. Little girls have been victims of the one-child policy from the very beginning. When I first began tracking the one-child policy, one thing that happened was that there were many, many cases of female infanticide, of little girls being killed after birth in the most horrific fashion.
Because
in some
the parents
cases,
wanted a boy.
The parents wanted a boy, and they would put a little girl to death. And they would tell the midwife who was delivering the child, if it's a little boy, you put him in this bucket of water, wash him off, and then we'll bundle him up in swaddling clothes and we'll all be happy. If it's a little girl, you put her in the bucket of water and don't let her breathe and drown her. And so they did it in that cruel fashion in the early years, or they would abandon little girls by the sides of roads. Now, of course, we have ultrasound machines all over China. And you know what they're principally used for? They're principally used to determine the sex of the unborn child that the woman is carrying. And if it's a little girl, sadly, it often results in, that determination often results in an abortion. So there have been tens of millions of little girls killed in this way by sex-selective abortion, by female infanticide, by female abandonment. And there are now tens of millions of young men in China who are looking for brides who will not be able to find brides because their brides have been killed.
So what are they doing?
Their brides, well, what they're doing is rates of prostitution are going up, so there are brothels springing up everywhere in China as men seek other sexual outlets. There is human trafficking in women across the length and breadth of China. There's also trafficking across borders. Young women are brought in from North Korea, which is desperately poor and starving, or brought in from Vietnam, or brought in from Burma, and sold to the highest bidder as wives. So there's human trafficking, the trafficking in women to try to make up for the bride shortfall. There aren't enough women in the rest of the countries of Asia, neighboring China, to make up for this shortfall. So many have been killed.
Unbelievable. Tell us what's happening in Eastern Europe now, which is going through its own death pangs, if you will, trying to follow this Chinese model. It's being embraced by the entire world via the UN and these other organizations.
Eastern Europe is dying. We have a demographic winter that has descended on all of Europe. I mean, we can talk about Eastern Europe and Russia, but it starts in Catholic Ireland, and it has now moved all the way to European Russia. The average Russian woman has 7 abortions over her reproductive lifetime. She gets pregnant 8 times, has 1 live birth, and 7 abortions. So Russia, I was just in Russia, we'll be going back in a few months. Russia has no future unless it abandons abortion, moves in the direction of protecting the sanctity of human life. Eastern Europe is in similar straits. They're having more abortions than live births. The birth rate is low and falling. China has a one-child policy, and so given that people in the cities are limited to one child and people in the countryside are sometimes allowed two, the average number of children born in China to a family is about 1.5. But in many European countries, the odd thing is that even without a one-child policy,
they have an effective one-child policy.
They have an effective
no-child.
one-child policy. They have in Russia, women average 1.2 children. In Eastern Europe, the numbers are roughly comparable. Even in Italy and Spain, they're averaging 1.1, 1.2 children per couple.
To what do you attribute that?
There are a lot of things going on, but one of the things that's happened is that the state has taken over so many functions of the family. If you have a cradle-to-grave welfare system where the state takes your children away from you at a young age and puts them in daycare centers and takes them away from you and educates them according not to your beliefs but to the state's beliefs and the state's needs, and then makes at least a pretense of caring for you in old age and breaks the tie between the generations that way. If you empty out the functions of the family, then families tend to disappear. Fewer people get married, and if they get married, they have fewer children. But of course, the abandonment of the Catholic faith is the big driving factor in Europe. The cathedrals in Europe are empty. One of the interesting things comparing China and Europe today is there are probably more people in church in China today than there are in church in the European countries all put together.
Wow, that's astounding. I want to return to China for a moment. Tell me about this aggressive military posture that China has recently adopted. They've unveiled an aircraft carrier. They are developing long-range missiles that could target our aircraft carriers in the region. What does this portend?
Well, people don't understand that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we turned to our so-called Beijing allies and said, isn't it wonderful that the common threat to you and us, the Soviet Union, has dissolved? And Deng Xiaoping said to his generals, there is a new Cold War now that the Soviet Union is gone. The new Cold War is between the United States and China. America is the new enemy. So they had no illusions about the fact that the primary obstacle to their dominance in the world, to their achieving hegemony, not just regional dominance but global dominance, is the United States of America. And they have been working very assiduously for over 2 decades now to achieve that end. They have upgraded their military. They have every year double-digit increases in their military budget. And people say, well, the United States spends $500 million, and China, according to the latest report that we have from the Pentagon, which I have in my hand here, is only spending $160 billion. So we're spending, aren't we, 3 times as much as China? Well, the difference is this. It costs us $100,000 to put a man in the field. It costs China $10,000 to put a man in the field. And so if you correct for purchasing power parity, the Chinese are spending far more rather than far less than we are on their military. And their military buildup is growing apace.
To what end? I mean, what do you think will happen to Tibet? I mean, if we have to leave the Red Sea, and once they put these missiles in place, one imagines that's the next domino to fall, yes?
Well, what China wants is a return to the traditional world order that it enjoyed for 2,000 years. And that is a world order with China at its center. Zhongguo, which is how you say China in Chinese, Zhongguo means the middle kingdom, the kingdom at the center of the earth. And for 2,000 years, China was that kingdom at the center of the earth. It was surrounded by weak tributary states. And every year you would have ambassadors from Vietnam and from Korea and other Asian countries coming to the imperial court in Beijing and knocking their heads on the floor 9 times. That was the imperial kowtow. In Chinese, that's pronounced ketou, and it means hit head. You had to hit your head on the floor 9 times, loud enough to be heard by the emperor on his throne as a sign of your submission to China. That's the way the world was organized for a long time, and I believe that's the way the Chinese Communist Party would like to see it organized in the future. China would once again like to be the center of the earth. That's what this is about.
Wow. Now, things are getting very aggressive. We read in Alberta, Canada, there is shares being sold in an oil interest there at 40% stake to a Chinese petrol interest, which is owned by the Chinese government. That's in Alberta, part of that pipeline we keep hearing about. So we're building this pipeline that will run up to Canada, but the Chinese could be standing at the spigot, yes?
Well, or worse than that, the pipeline could never get built down to the Texas oil refineries, but there could be another pipeline built across Canada to Vancouver, British Columbia, where Chinese tankers would pick up the crude oil and take it back to China to refine. China is going around the world not playing by the rules of the free market. It is buying up primary resources, raw materials at the mine or in the oil field. It's trying to, instead of buying oil on the open market, for example, it's doing exactly what you just mentioned. It's buying up entire oil fields, trying to control the source of oil and raw materials at their source rather than buying them on the open market. That's very dangerous for the world economy.
Yeah,
in the
it'll
future.
destabilize. I mean, you could destabilize the world economy, particularly if you control petrol.
We already have an example of that. Last year, a year and a half ago, a Chinese fishing vessel invaded Japanese territorial waters. A Japanese coastal patrol boat tried to stop the Chinese fishing vessel, which rammed the Japanese Navy patrol boat. They arrested the Chinese crew, and in retaliation for that, China cut off supplies of what's called rare earth exports to Japan. Now, every Japanese car relies on rare earth to manufacture the electronics. China has a monopoly on rare earth, and by cutting off the supply of rare earth to Japan, it threatened to basically shut down the Japanese automobile industry and the Japanese electronics industry altogether. So we can expect that kind of economic warfare in the future if China gets a stranglehold on anything critical to modern industrial production, like rare earth or like oil or anything else.
And cyber warfare, which we're hearing increasing reports of, that seem to be coming from China and hackers in China. One story I read, you had the Chamber of Commerce. Their computers were hacked, and it got so granular, they actually had a thermostat at a Capitol Hill townhouse they own that was being hacked into by Chinese hackers. I mean, when it's down to that level, printers were suddenly spitting out papers with Chinese characters. What is going on here?
Well, what's going on is China has set up a fourth branch of its military. China now has the People's Liberation Army, Air Force, Navy, and Cyber War Department. So the cyber warfare department is on equal footing with the other three. Now, if we had a Chinese aircraft carrier sail into San Francisco Bay, we would take notice of it. We don't see that. What we also don't see are the constant cyber attacks that are emanating from the Cyber War Division of the People's Liberation Army, where literally you have battalions of internet technicians, hackers, every day trying to penetrate the Department of Defense, all the Homeland Security Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Private companies are also at risk. Computers at every level are being penetrated by this massive government-funded operation. And you know, you have hackers in Russia, you have hackers in other countries, but these are usually, you know, mafia-type operations, small scale. China is carrying this out on a grand scale. This is the cyber equivalent of war that's going on all the time.
And yet, when I read some of these reports, when I talk to security experts, they say there's another layer here that really hasn't been touched much upon. China often assembles so many of our devices, our computers. Apple, which so many of us use, designed in Cupertino, California, made in China. And one of these security experts suggested to me, and I've subsequently seen it elsewhere, they could be encoding and layering in malicious code that could be turned on by those who installed it initially to do all manner of, gain all manner of access to the information there. Big concern, and we really don't hear anything about it.
No, we don't. And even where Pentagon procurement is concerned, there is a domestic requirement for assembling weapon systems that more than half the parts need to be made in the United States. The Pentagon is having difficulty getting electronic components that were actually made in the United States and not in China. And think about how well a missile would function if a key electronic component was made in China with a backdoor access to China so that it could turn off the component at a critical moment. I mean, you don't want to be in a situation where you depend on your potential enemy for component parts for your weapon systems, do you?
Oh, terrifying. Let's talk about religious freedom in China. People say, a lot of businessmen I talk to, there's lots of religious freedom in China. Don't believe the stories you hear. The Patriotic Association, which is the government-run version of the Catholic Church, they get along very well with the so-called underground church, Stephen. You would say what?
I would say that it depends on where you are in China. In many parts of China, you have members who are nominally of the Patriotic Association who are actually, making sure they attend masses that are celebrated by a priest who is in union with Rome, or bishops who are in union with Rome. But what we should be talking about is the intent of the Chinese Communist Party. And what the intent of the Chinese Communist Party is to completely control all religious activity in the country. And they do that for two reasons, one of which is the Communist Party is officially atheistic. You cannot be a party member unless you subscribe to the atheistic faith, or lack of faith, I suppose we should better put it. You also the party also controls education and teaches all Chinese school children that atheism is what the belief system that they should adopt. So the atheism is a problem. The other thing is this: the Chinese Communist Party, being a communist party, is conspiratorial by nature, and it is paranoid by nature, and it suspects, therefore, conspiracies everywhere. And it does not allow freedom of association in any sphere of activity. You can't organize a chess club in China unless you get official government permission. So the idea that people should be meeting in their homes, or people should be going to hear Mass celebrated by a priest who hasn't sworn loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party, sets off alarm bells in the minds of these Communist Party apparatchiks who want to control all activity in China, who want to suppress all non-governmental organizations, but especially the Catholic Church. And why the Catholic Church? Because the Catholic Church is headed by a German Pope who resides not in China and therefore can't be controlled, but resides in Rome. And that, the Chinese Communist Party finds intolerable. There will never be religious freedom in China, despite the fact that it's guaranteed by the Constitution, despite the fact that Catholicism is one of the 5 official religions allowed in China. There will never be de facto religious freedom in China as long as the Chinese Communist Party exists, because it will not allow it.
Yeah, because it's vying for authority over these individuals, these souls, in their mind anyway. That's what they would. Companies like Amway like to do home presentations. Amway was banned in China in 1998 because the Chinese Communist Party did not like the idea of people gathering in their homes to talk about things. That was an unapproved kind of association. Fascinating. Where do we go from here? And tell me about the Confucian Institutes on their way to a university or a campus near you.
Well, the Chinese government, starting about a decade ago, decided to launch a massive propaganda campaign in the United States. And it did several things. The first thing it did is it bought programming on American television, so that if you have satellite TV now, you can always find a Chinese channel which is showing you beautiful pictures of the Chinese countryside and wonderfully unspoiled landscapes and the Great Wall and so forth, to create warm and fuzzy feelings about China. The other part of this, though, is the Chinese government is also now funding what are called Confucian Institutes at colleges and universities throughout the country. These Confucian Institutes are dedicated to creating a positive image of China in the minds of the next generation of Americans. If you go into a Confucian Institute, you will find lots of information about China's glorious history, lots of information about the benign intentions of the Chinese Communist Party, and no information at all about the persecution of Tibet, which has led 15 Tibetan monks in the last few weeks to burn themselves alive in protest of ongoing Chinese repression. You will hear nothing in the Confucian Institutes about the ongoing one-child policy and forced abortions. You won't hear about the labor camps where dissidents of all stripes are slaving away in mines because they had the temerity to criticize the Chinese Communist Party. So these are propaganda outlets.
And what do you say to those who would, I'm sure, parry and say, Mr. Mosher, we have trade with China. They're open to our marketplace, and therefore American ideas, American ideals accompany the products we send into mainland China. We are changing them every day. The exchange is good.
I would say 30 years ago, I was spouting that same line because I believe that once China opened up to the West, and once we began to have free cultural and scholarly exchanges with China, that China would become more like us. And it hasn't. It has become more like traditional China has always been. China has always been an imperial power. It is growing into an imperial power today. China has always, in one sense, oppressed its own people because it's never enjoyed democracy or human rights. And that's happening again today. The Chinese human rights situation is as bad as it has been at any time since the 1989 Tiananmen massacre.
For more information on Stephen Mosher's work, go to his website, pop.org. And I want to remind you to visit RaymondArroyo.com. Sign up for our Facebook and Twitter pages. It's all there on the left-hand side of the home page. And I've got commentary there. I'm also posting a couple of articles about China, about the political race that you'll want to read. RaymondArroyo.com. Like me on Twitter and follow me on Facebook. Or is it the other way around? I can't keep this straight. Until next week, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. We'll see you then. Bye now.